I'm the law of this land. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. And your wicked days are done.
Before we get started, I want to give a huge spoiler warning. This episode is going to spoil the entire series, Lawmen Bass Reeves, which was recently released on Netflix. I'm going to break it down episode by episode and talk about what the show got right, what it changed, what it left out, and what was completely fictional. So if you have not watched this series yet and you don't want to spoil anything, go watch it first, then come back to this episode. Now I'll say this right up front. I thought this series was amazing. It was well acted, entertaining, beautifully shot, and had some really powerful moments. But was it 100% historically accurate? Not even close. That being said, the show was not trying to be a documentary. It was a dramatized TV series, and there are some real events from Bass Reeves' life woven into the story. So today, we are going to separate the real history from the Hollywood version. If you want the full story of Bass Reeves' life, go listen to my 8-part deep dive series I did on Bass Reeves. In that series, I break down his life from start to finish. His birth into slavery, his escape during the Civil War, his years in Indian Territory, his time as Deputy U.S. Marshal, the outlaws he chased, the gunfights, the arrests, the legends, the controversies, and the real man behind it all. Right now that series is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you listen. But if this video gets some attention, I'll post the whole thing on YouTube. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. The show opens with Bass Reeves in the middle of the Civil War serving alongside George Reeves, the man who enslaved him at the Battle of Pea Ridge. In the show, George hands Bass a rifle and tells him,
"You will follow me, and you will fire."
Moments later, the two of them are charging on horseback straight toward a Union artillery position. It is a big, cinematic opening. Cannon fire, smoke, horses, chaos, and Bass is thrown directly into a battle beside his master. Then after the fighting, the show takes it even further, with Esau Pierce, a fictional character, taking a scalp from a Union soldier like he's Buffalo Bill in the famous first scalp for Custer painting. We will talk more about Esau next. Now as far as television goes, I understand why they opened it this way. It immediately puts Bass into a violent, brutal world, shows the audience that he is not just standing on the sidelines, and sets up the trauma and conflict that follows him throughout the series. But historically, this is where we have to slow down. Like I talked about early in my Bass Reeves series, Bass may or may not have fought during the Civil War. We cannot confirm it with concrete facts, and we also can't completely deny every possibility. So when the show has George Reeves hand Bass a rifle, then has the two of them charge a Union artillery line on horseback, I'll put it this way. Could something like that have happened in some chaotic moment of the war? Technically maybe. Is there any actual evidence that Bass Reeves and George Reeves charged a Union artillery position together like that? No. And in complete honesty, the chances of that specific scene happening are probably about 99% of it not happening. So let's break down what we actually know. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, George Reeves joined the 11th Texas Cavalry Regiment under Colonel William G. Young. Bass Reeves later said in a 1901 interview that he served as a body servant and accompanied George Reeves into the battles at Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge. In another account, Bass also said he had been at the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas, where he saw Texas hero General Ben McCulloch die. And that is where the timeline starts getting tricky. The Battle of Pea Ridge happened in early 1862. Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge happened later in 1863. So the big question is this. When Bass said he accompanied George in a battle, what exactly did he mean? Was he fighting beside him? Was he helping around camp? Was he close enough to witness the fighting without officially being part of it? We just don't know. There are no records that clearly tell us Bass Reeves' exact role during the Civil War. Records were not really being kept for enslaved body servants of Confederate officers, and George Reeves does not mention Bass in his own war memoirs. And that matters. Black men were not legally allowed to serve as Confederate combat soldiers. But according to American Battlefield Trust, when talking about slaves in the Confederacy, quote, most of these were forced to accompany their masters, or were forced to toil behind the lines. Black men were not legally allowed to serve as combat soldiers in the Confederate Army. They were cooks, teamsters, and manual laborers. There were no black Confederate combat units in service during the war, and no documentation whatsoever exists for any black man being paid or pensioned as a Confederate soldier, although some did receive pension for their work as laborers. So yes, the official role of the slaves on the Confederacy side of the war could not be official soldiers. They worked in more of the camp chores, supply lines, etc. But, later on in the article, quote, "This is not to say that no black man ever fired a gun for the Confederacy. To be specific, in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, there are a total of 7 Union eyewitness reports of black Confederates. 3 of these reports mention black men shooting at Union soldiers. 1 report mentions capturing a handful of armed black men along with some soldiers, and the other 3 reports mention seeing unarmed black laborers. So there are some reports of slaves fighting for the Confederacy. Let's be real for a second. I don't think I'm the only person in the world that believes in some situations that these enslaved men fought side by side with their masters, especially when things got hot. That being said, I'm not an expert. I'm not a historian. This is just my personal opinion. But did Bass fight side by side with his master? Unfortunately, we have no idea what his role was, but most likely, he just worked as a camp hand. Alright, let's discuss Esau for just 1 second. No, Esau was not a real person. He was a fictional character that we will discuss throughout this video. Just wanted to put it out there right away. When George Reeves deserts after telling the general of his bad decision to leave the supply wagons behind, they are laying around the fire, and Bass talks about how he wanted to learn to read so he could read the Bible. This is true. Bass never learned how to read, and instead, George taught Bass how to use a rifle and pistol, in which Bass was an excellent shot. George would put him in turkey shoots that Bass consistently won, with George reaping the benefits. Shocker, I know. The TV series got his wife's name correct. Her name was Jenny. The next big question is this: did Bass Reeves really beat his master over a card game and escape? From everything that I could find, yes, the fight and the escape did happen. What we do not know for certain is exactly how it all went down, or whether it really started over a card game. According to Bass's daughter, Alice Spawn, body servants often became close to the men they served, and in some cases were even viewed as their master's closest companion. In Bass's case, something went very differently. She said young Bass got into a heated argument with George Reeves, gave him a beating, and then made his run for Indian Territory. According to her account, Bass, quote, laid him out with his fists and then fled north across the Red River. The details are where things get a little blurry. We do not know the exact date, but the fight itself and Bass escaping from George Reeves appears to be true. R.T. Burton, Bass's biographer who wrote the amazing book Black Gun Silver Star, believed this likely happened earlier in the war rather than later, which means Bass was probably not at the later battles of Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge, despite what Bass claimed later. Burton's reasonings make sense. Bass later knew Indian Territory incredibly well. Burton described it by saying Bass knew the territory, quote, like a cook knows his or her kitchen. He also learned to speak Muskogee, the language of the Creeks and Seminoles, and could communicate well enough in the languages of the other 5 civilized tribes. That kind of knowledge would have taken time. So if Bass had escaped farther east, after battles like Chickamauga in northwest Georgia or Missionary Ridge in southeast Tennessee, it becomes harder to explain how he made it all the way back to Indian Territory, and still had enough time to learn the land, the people, the languages, and the customs so thoroughly. But the Battle of Pea Ridge was different. The Battle of Pea Ridge took place in northwest Arkansas, very close to the border of what is now Oklahoma, or what was then Indian Territory. So if Bass escaped sometime after Pea Ridge, that route makes much more sense. Now this does create another question. Why would Bass later say he was at Chickamauga and Missionary Ridge if he had already escaped before those battles? Honestly, I do not know. Burton mentions an old-timer who claimed Bass Reeves had actually been a sergeant in the Union Army during the Civil War. There were African Americans who served in the Union's 1st Indian Home Guard Regiment, a unit made up largely of Seminole, Creekmen, and freedmen. Freedmen was a term used for formerly enslaved people, including escaped slaves. So could there be some confusion there? Maybe. Could parts of Bass's Civil War story have been mixed together over time? Possibly. But the idea that Bass Reeves served as a Union sergeant is very unlikely. The safest answer is this. Bass Reeves was with George Reeves during at least part of the Civil War, likely escaped after a violent confrontation, made his way into Indian Territory, and from that point forward began building the knowledge and skills that would later make him legendary. Now after his escape, I think the show did a good job of showing the reality of the situation, and frankly, we do not know much about his escape or what exactly happened. That's why I actually like what the show did with Jenny in this scene. She understands what Bass is facing. She knows that he must run. She knows he is heading into dangerous country with no clear protection, no easy path, and no certainty that anyone he meets will help him. But if he stays, he faces certain death. And historically, that part is true. Now, did he run into the 3 men on horseback and kill all 3 of them and escape? Unlikely. I think it is just a way to show off how good Bass was with firearms. Throughout his entire life, countless men would reference how fast Bass was with a pistol and how deadly it was with a Winchester. We do not know every detail of Bass's escape. We do not know the exact route he took, how long it took him, or who he met in those first days after crossing the Red River. But we do know that he fled into Indian territory, and that journey would have been extremely dangerous. He would have been moving through rough country, trying to evade capture, likely hungry, tired, and unsure who he could trust. He was leaving behind slavery, but he was not stepping into safety. He was stepping into the unknown. This leads into the show having Bass discovered by the Seminole woman and her son. Now, historically, we don't know if Bass was found by a Seminole woman. We do not know if there was a boy with her. That appears to be the show creating a fictional storyline to represent a part of Bass's life where the record is very thin. But the idea behind it works, because what we know is that Bass spent time among native people in Indian territory. He learned the land, the customs, and the languages of the tribes around him. So even if the specific woman and boy from the show are fictional, they represent something real. Bass's survival in Indian territory depended on learning from the people who lived there. And this is another area where I think the show did a pretty good job. It does not treat Indian territory as just a place Bass ran through. It shows it as a place where he began to change. This is where he learned how to survive in that country, how to move through it, how to understand it, and how to communicate with the people who knew it best. That time in Indian territory became one of the most important chapters of his life. But the next part is where the show seems to take a much bigger creative liberty. After Bass spends some time with the Seminole woman and the boy, the series has Asa return at the Turkey Creek trading post as a captured man, but is freed by some of his compatriots and he ends up murdering the boy. Now remember, Asa is a fictional character, and as far as I can find, Bass Reeves never mentions anything like this happening during that part of his life. He never mentions the Seminole woman, he never mentions the boy, and he never describes a traumatic event like this. And with something that horrific, you would think there would be some kind of trace of it in the historical record, or at least in the stories Bass later told about his life, but there does not appear to be. So while this scene works dramatically for the TV series, historically, it is almost certainly fictional. This is one of the moments where Hollywood seems to be taking a thin part of Bass Reeves' life and filling in the gaps with drama and tragedy. One quick note that they show throughout the TV series is Bass's connection with horses. The historical record shows that Bass was amazing with horses, and even while he was still a boy, William Reeves, George Reeves' father, trusted Bass with his prize horses. We do not know exactly how Jenny and Bass reunited. That said, Bass most likely did not go back to the Reeves plantation. We also don't know how Jenny made it to Fort Smith. But when they met again, I thought it was a nice little touch. When she has a little girl and Bass saying that he hopes her new man treats her right, and how she explains he has a bad habit of up and leaving and introduces him to his daughter, I just thought it was a sweet moment. Always helps having a strong woman by your side who has a little bit of attitude. And that ends episode 1. Episode 2 starts with Bass staring at the fire of his crops in Van Buren, and debuts his legendary mustache. I mean, come on, that thing is incredible. He built that house with his own hands. His daughter Alice Spawn called the house a showplace that had 8 rooms. She said that they had a big barn with spotless stalls and well-tended horses. Newland, one of Bass's sons, was assigned to taking care of the horses, which makes me wonder how much Bass had taught his boys how to properly care for the horses. But Bass was said to be a horrible farmer, so the show does a good job of showing just that. A short time later, the show introduces a U.S. Marshal named Cheryl Lynn. Now, Cheryl Lynn is a fictional character. He was actually brought into the service by U.S. Marshal James F. Fagan. But Cheryl Lynn is played by Dennis Quaid, who is honestly one of my favorite actors. And I'll say this, I thought he played the role really well. Even though the character is fictional, I do think the show does a good job of using him to introduce how Bass eventually became connected to the U.S. Marshal Service. It gives the audience a clear way to understand how Bass's knowledge of Indian territory, his ability to track, and his ability to speak native languages would have made him extremely valuable to federal lawmen. When Bass first rides out, they briefly show the deadline, where in the future, Bass would receive many letters and notes, all calling for his life. This paid homage to the real deadline of Indian Territory, and the notes are actually a true story. Once they crossed that line, there were no laws, just outlaws. It was also referenced in episode 4 of the series by Minko. The first shootout Bass is involved in was a good display of just how fast it can go from calm to chaos in a matter of a second. The legendary quote that I absolutely love is when Bass said, "Black, white, or red, we all just men." I think that quote is powerful, and it is one of my favorites, not only in the series, but in any movie or show. One Charlie was a real man Bass Reeves arrested on the 16th of July, 1900, but the way the TV show portrays it is fictionalized. In the show, Charlie gets into a shootout with Marshal Cheryl Lynn and Bass Reeves. Cheryl sets the cabin on fire, and Charlie vacates a home in a blaze, and Bass shoots him. That is not how the real arrest of one Charlie played out. However, I do think this scene may have been inspired by the story of Ned Christie. Ned Christie was a fugitive in Indian Territory, and Bass Reeves was part of the posse that went after him. During that pursuit, Reeves and the posse did burn down Christie's cabin, but Christie was not killed there. He escaped and remained on the run until he was later killed by another posse after they forced him out in the open and killed him. So while one Charlie was a real person Bass Reeves arrested, the dramatic cabin shootout and fire shown in Lawmen Bass Reeves appears to be fictional. If anything, it seems like the show may have borrowed pieces from the Ned Christie story and attached them to the one Charlie storyline for dramatic effect. Later on, Bass and Cheryl Lynn get into an argument which results in Bass punching him and then leaving. There is nothing in the historical record that says Bass punched the U.S. Marshal. It could have happened, it could not have, but it seems unlikely. Episode 2 ends with Cheryl Lynn riding up with 2 other men, saying he recommended Bass to Judge Parker, and Parker wanting him to make him a Deputy U.S. Marshal. I think the show does a good job of showing the moment Bass realizing life was about to make a big change. Episode 3 begins with Bass going to meet Judge Isaac C. Parker. I think this is important to pause for a second and explain exactly who Parker was. Judge Parker was not just some random judge sitting in Fort Smith. He became one of the most famous judges in the American West, and he would eventually be known as the Hanging Judge. And there was a reason for that. Parker's court had jurisdiction over Indian Territory, which was one of the most dangerous and difficult places in the country for law enforcement. Deputy U.S. Marshals were riding into a massive region filled with outlaws, murderers, whiskey peddlers, horse thieves, and men who knew the land far better than most lawmen chasing them. This quote from R.T. Burton's book does a great job of explaining what Parker, Bass Reeves, and the other marshals were up against. Quote, "The Indian Territory was where the majority of Deputy U.S. Marshals had been killed in the line of duty in the history of the Marshal Service. You're looking at a little over 200 who had been killed in the line of duty to this date right now. On record, over 130 were killed in the Indian Territory. You had Indian policemen getting killed. You had town municipal policemen getting killed. It had been the greatest battleground between crime and law in the history of the United States of America." In a time frame from the 10th of May 1875 and the 1st of September 1896, Judge Isaac C. Parker tried 13,490 criminal cases and won more than 8,500 of them. Roughly 1 in every 100 of those found guilty were given the sentence of death. For everyone else, it was prison for 1 to 45 years in one of the state pens that accepted federal prisoners. So when the show brings Bass into Parker's office and shows him becoming a U.S. Deputy Marshal, this was no small thing. Bass was now tasked with bringing law to a land that was full of deadly outlaws. Also, quick note, Bass Reeves is said to be the first black Deputy U.S. Marshal, but he wasn't officially the first. From Burton's book, quote, "According to one story in the Indian Pioneer Papers at the Oklahoma State History Museum, a federal posse was sent out from Van Buren under the leadership of a man known as, I'm paraphrasing, Black Smith. The posse investigated a stagecoach robbery near Atoka in the Choctaw Nation in 1867. Burton then goes on to say how if we look at the real western frontier, you also found blacks who were in law enforcement across the West, in Colorado, Montana, and New Mexico. 20% of the military on the western frontier were African Americans. That being said, there weren't many deputy marshals, and Bass Reeves was one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals. Billy Crow is a fictional character, but I think his storyline does a good job of showing the kind of toughness Bass Reeves was known for. When you research Bass Reeves, one thing that comes up again and again is how calm he could remain in dangerous situations. He had this coolness under pressure. Not cold in the sense that he had no feeling, but cold in the sense that when things got hostile, Bass did not panic. He did not lose control. He stayed focused on the job in front of him. The Underwood Gang, as shown in the series, was not a real Indian Territory gang, but I do think they were meant to represent the kind of violent outlaw groups Bass Reeves really did deal with throughout his career. Indian Territory was full of dangerous men, and Bass spent decades riding into that country with warrants in his pocket. I also think the show did a good job during the scenes where Bass and his posse men are bringing Billy Crow into Fort Smith. Billy Crow knows that if the Underwood Gang finds him, they will kill him. So there's already tension before anything even happens. Then you have Bass refusing to build a fire because he does not want to give away their location, which feels very realistic. These men were not camping for comfort, they were trying to survive long enough to get their prisoner back to court. Then Billy tries to talk his way out of custody by giving up the location of the gang's money. That also works well dramatically, because it shows the kind of temptation and pressure that could exist on the trail. The prisoner might lie, bargain, manipulate, or try anything he could think of to turn the situation in his favor. Then the shootout happens, and I thought that part was effective because how quickly everything turns. 1 second they are talking, the next second, everything explodes into violence. Now the scene was definitely dramatized, especially with Bass's possemen arguing that they should go after the money, and then being killed by the gang during that argument. But the larger point still works. It shows how dangerous that job could be, and how fast a quiet moment on the trail could become a fight for your life. A bribery attempt did happen during Bass's actual life. A prisoner named William Watson tried to bribe both Bass and another deputy marshal, Jacob T. Ayers. He was unsuccessful in taking to Fort Smith, but there was a court case, and both Reeves and Ayers were found to have done nothing wrong. They also show how Bass tied up the boots of the men he had killed in the shootout to collect when he made it back to Fort Smith. This would have provided proof that he had killed an outlaw, but it isn't necessarily the truth. Breeding in the boots of a dead outlaw would have done nothing to prove him an outlaw's death. The body, yes, but the boots? No. Myson Davis, the boy who stole because he was hungry and killed a man, was not a real person. This was a fictional character and event, though it is an event that could have happened. And that ends episode 3. Episode 4 begins with Bass shooting holes in his cap and walking up to a woman's cabin. And if you notice an audio difference, I apologize. I'm recording this over 2 days. Now this may seem highly dramatized, with the whole down and out drifter disguise walking up into the cabin and arresting the 2 boys while they're sleeping, but it is actually a very good representation of exactly what happened. From my series on Bass Reeves, here's how the situation happened according to the historical record. In 1938, Andy Grayson, a Creek freedman, did an interview for the Indian Pioneer papers and gave the following story. There were 2 wanted outlaws with a $5,000 price on their heads, roughly $150,000 today, and Reeves was determined to claim the reward. He learned that the 2 men were south on the Texas border in the Red River Valley. He gathered his posse and set up camp about 28 miles from where he thought the outlaws were. He did this as it allowed him to devise a careful plan for their capture, without raising any alarms, while also giving them a chance to survey the surrounding terrain. He came up with the idea of disguising himself as a down-and-out drifter who was traveling through the area, running from the law. This gave him the opportunity that if he wasn't successful in finding the men, he wouldn't raise any suspicion that he was indeed a Deputy U.S. Marshal. He played fully into the act, carrying only a 6-shooter and a hidden pair of handcuffs. He wore ragged clothes, removed the heels from an old pair of boots, carried a cane and wore an old floppy cowboy hat in which he had shot 3 bullet holes into. Bass walked the 28 miles before he reached his destination, the home of the mother of the 2 men. As he walked up to the house, the mother came out to see what he wanted, and Bass played fully into his role, no doubt sweating and breathing heavily after his long walk through the Oklahoma heat. Bass asked if he could have a bite to eat, saying that he was very hungry and his feet were blistered from the long walk, that lawmen were hard on his trail and even shot at him, and that's why he had the bullet holes in his hat. The mother replied that she would be glad to give him something to eat and invited Bass inside. While Bass was eating, the mother began to talk about her boys, telling him that her boys were always wanted by the law, always on the run, and that Bass should join forces with them. When night had come, Bass heard a sharp whistle from the creek. The old woman went outside and responded. Then two riders approached the house and they talked to the woman outside for a while, but finally came inside. Bass and the boys agreed to join up. When they were getting ready for bed, a bed was prepared for Bass in a separate room, but he suggested that they all sleep in one room, stating that something might happen and if they are separated, they couldn't be much protection for one another. The boys agreed. Bass slept in the bed and the brothers on the floor. While in bed, Bass kept a vigilant watch over the men. Soon, the men were sound asleep. As sunlight began to peek through the window, Bass kicked the boys awake and said, "Come on, boys, let's get going from here." Once the men were fully alert, Bass had his 6-shooter in hand and they realized that they were in the custody of a Deputy U.S. Marshal. As Reeves led the boys to his camp, the mother followed for 3 miles, cursing him and calling him every name in the book. Bass Reeves was known for using all sorts of different disguises and ploys and played fully into every part. He had learned from the Native Americans that if he rode low in the saddle, he would appear smaller than he really was. Since Bass was a big man for the time, he stood out like a sore thumb. So when riding through Indian territory chasing outlaws and bandits, he used every trick he could. Ramsey, the man that mentions old Mr. Sundown, was not a real person, at least not from anything I can find in the historical record. That being said, Bass Reeves did have a strange encounter with a Seminole medicine man named Yawkey, and it is possible that the show was loosely playing off that type of story. If you want the full version, go listen to my 8-part series on Bass Reeves. I covered this story in episode 3, but here's the short version. Bass Reeves once told D.C. Gideon about arresting a group of men for horse theft, including an old medicine man named Yawkey. During the trip back to Fort Smith, Bass suddenly became terribly sick, stiff, swollen, weak, and thirsty, and he began to believe Yawkey had bewitched him. While barely able to move, Bass noticed a string hanging from Yawkey's hidden pocket and pulled out what he believed was the old man's conjure bag, filled with roots, pebbles, and bits of hair. Bass threw the bag into a nearby creek, and Yawkey immediately woke up, telling him that his power was gone. Yawkey begged Bass to take off his chains and promised to follow him, but Bass refused. According to Bass, the moment the bag hit the water, he began to recover, and by that evening, he felt completely well again. Yawkey told him afterward that if he had not lost his conjure bag, Bass would have been dead before they reached Fort Smith, and Bass believes it too. So no, that character was not a real person. That was just a show creating more drama, suspense, and danger around Bass's journey. But Bass Reeves did have at least one recorded story of a unique encounter with a prisoner. And old Mr. Sundown, we will discuss later. His conversation with Minko is important to the story of Bass Reeves, because Bass would often use native peoples for knowledge. Since he had escaped Indian territory after beating George Reeves, he had the trust of the native peoples in the region, and he used that trust to gain information on what was happening. So I really like how the show referenced this. Silas Cobb was the outlaw given up indirectly by Minko. Although the event is not a real event of Bass Reeves' life, he does give information to a very real outlaw, Jim Webb, which we will talk about soon. But Silas Cobb and the whole event of Billy Crow killing him was fictional, as there is nothing in the historical record that mentions this. The episode ends with Bass and his horse down by the creek, and a man on top of a ridge looking down on them. This is a reference of how Bass was on the trail for Jim Webb. The man would have been serving as sort of a scout for Webb, which leads to the beginning of episode 5. Episode 5 begins with Bass and Billy Crow staring at a man hanging from a tree, with a warning note that says Bass Reeves will swing here. From there, the show moves to Bywater's General Store and leads into the shootout with Jim Webb. And honestly, I think this series did a pretty good job with this part. It was not 100% accurate, but the general setup worked well. In the show, Billy Crow goes into the store first and gathers information, while Bass stays back and slowly moves into position, trying to get the drop on Webb. Then gunfire erupts from inside the store. The fight spills out, and Bass and Webb end up in a running shootout. Bass chases him through the corral and eventually kills him. Now the real story played out differently. The gunfight really did begin at Bywater's General Store, but there is a lot more history behind that moment than the TV series had time to show. The series gave us action, but not the full backstory of Jim Webb, his earlier killing of Reverend William Stewart, his first arrest by Bass Reeves, his release on bond, and the events that eventually led to this final confrontation. Also, unlike the show, no one else was killed in the actual shootout except Jim Webb. Again, I'm not going to go into every single detail here. If you want the full version, go listen to my deep dive series. For this episode, I'm going to focus on the final shootout with Jim Webb, and this version of the story comes from DC Gideon. His actual posseman was named John Cantrell, and he sent him ahead to make sure Webb was in Bywater's store. After confirming he was there, Cantrell signaled to Bass that Webb was there. But as Bass approached, Webb spied him and jumped through an open window armed with a revolver in one hand and Winchester in another. Webb ran for his horse, but Bass cut him off. Webb turned toward a clump of bushes and ran about 600 yards. He then turned and fired. The first shot grazed the horn of Reeves' saddle. The second cut a button from his coat, and the third cut off both bridle reins below his hand. As Bass jumped off his horse, a fourth shot cut the brim of his hat. Reeves then took up a position and fired 2 shots from his Winchester and hit Webb. As Bass approached the mortally wounded outlaw, Webb reportedly said to Bass, quote, "You are a brave man. I want you to accept my revolver and scabbard as a present, and you must accept them. Take it, for with it I have killed 11 men, 4 of them in Indian territory, and I expected you to make the 12th. Bass accepted the pistol and carefully stored it away. So the show did reference Bass Reeves killing Jim Webb, but not exactly how it happened. And they also didn't show Bass's legendary shot of 600 yards. I mean, come on, that would have been amazing. And to the question of whether it was really 600 yards, I do a full breakdown in the series, with a firearms expert that I talk to, and we really break each part down. But to answer it quickly, no one who was there and watched it happen ever said anything about it not happening, if that tells you anything. After his shootout with Webb, the show introduces Ike, an old posseman of Bass Reeves, and this is an actual person. His name was Isaac Ike Rogers, a Deputy U.S. Marshal. He was a Cherokee freedman who worked alongside Bass at times. I think the show does a good job of showing that right when Bass was about to finally go home, he's called to duty again. Then when he finally returns home, his family is not all giddy to see him like normal. It shows that Bass was gone so much that his younger children seem to not even recognize him. I think this pays homage to the fact that U.S. Deputy Marshals worked long periods of time, and it must have been hard on them and their families. Jackson Cole, the man Bass Reeves is tasked with to return to Texas, is a fictional character, and the James Neblett story appears to be fictional as well. In the show, Neblett is the plantation owner who murdered enslaved people at Rock Rose Plantation, leading to Jackson Cole to kill him years later. But from everything I could find, there is no historical record connecting Bass Reeves to this event, and I cannot find evidence that the Rock Rose Plantation tragedy happened as shown in the series. This seems to be another case where the show creates a fictional storyline to explore real post-Civil War racial violence, trauma, and injustice. The same thing can be said for the storyline involving Sally and Arthur, after the carnival and the big fight. Also, Arthur is a fictional character. I could not find anything showing that Sally Reeves and Arthur had this conversation, or that Bass's family was involved in an incident like the one shown in the series. But again, I do understand what the show is trying to do. Even if the exact event is fictional, it is showing the kind of racial tension and danger of the times. Bass Reeves may have been a respected Deputy U.S. Marshal, but that did not mean his family was protected from racism, threats, or violence. Episode 5 ends with Bass delivering Jackson Cole to the Texas Rangers and encounters Esau Pierce, leaving us on a cliffhanger for Episode 6. Episode 6 starts with Bass and Esau talking about a captive wolf and the delivery of Jackson Cole. Remember how Esau was always saying they are wolves, the whole drama tale? It's just that, adding drama to the storyline. But the real Bass Reeves had plenty of run-ins with Texas Rangers, as later in his lawman career, he worked in Paris, Texas, where he would go after the Tom Story gang, where he would kill Tom Story in a gunfight in 1889. In the TV series, Bass was cornered by some outlaws who knew that he killed Webb. They first beat him, then play some revolver roulette, and then Billy Crow kills one of the outlaws, and Bass and Billy Crow chase them down and the whole deal. It's a great entertaining scene, filled with all sorts of legends that are said to have happened in the West. The 2 outlaws coming out dressed as women, the sneak shot by Bass through the barn door, all things that could have happened, but the historical record does not give any indication that it did. Could it have? Yes. But we can't verify it, and with almost every killing, especially one that has multiple deaths, there are multiple accounts of how it all played out. Edwin Jones and Esme are fictional characters added to this storyline. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but better late than never. That being said, a character like Edwin Jones does represent something that could have existed in Bass Reeves' life. Bass was a very influential man, especially when you consider the time and place he lived in. As I talked about earlier, he was one of the first black Deputy U.S. Marshals, and he served in a region where the badge carried serious weight. So it is not hard to believe that other African American men and women in the area would have looked to him with respect, curiosity, or even hope. Does that mean there was a real Edwin Jones or Esme tied to Bass Reeves in the way the show portrays? No, not from anything I could find. But the idea behind those characters makes sense. And I love what Bass says, that his job is to protect everybody, black, red, or white, and his wife having his back. Badass woman. I love that part. I think the show does a really good job of showing the weight Bass's career would have carried. Is it dramatic? Absolutely. But the foundation of it makes sense. Jenny tells him that every time he comes home, he brings back less and less of himself. And I think that line captures something important. Bass Reeves spent years riding in a dangerous country, hunting violent men, getting shot at, sleeping in rough camps, dragging prisoners back to Fort Smith, and constantly living with the possibility that he might not make it home. A life like that would take something out of a person. Even today, we see that with our military members, police officers, firefighters, EMTs, nurses, doctors, and other first responders. The weight of the job affects everyone differently. Some people carry it quietly, some become harder, some bring it home with them even when they aren't trying to. So while the show may dramatize that part of Bass's life, I think it does a good job of showing that being a legendary lawman came at a cost. Bass Reeves was tough, disciplined, and incredibly effective, but that does not mean the job did not wear on him or affect the people he loved. And to our military members, police officers, firefighters, EMTs, nurses, doctors, and all of our first responders, God bless you. I know I have quite a few of you who listen to this podcast, and I just want to say thank you. The weight of those jobs is something most people never fully understand. You see things most people never have to see, carry things most people never have to carry, and still show up when others need you the most. Without badass people like y'all, willing to run toward danger, answer the call, work the long nights, make the hard decisions, and take care of the people on the worst days of their lives, this world would look a whole lot different. So for me, and I'm sure a lot of people listening, thank you. I appreciate you, I respect you, and God bless every single one of you. Episode 6 ends with Bass imagining Esau, bringing that fictional storyline and all of that drama surrounding it back to the surface. There is honestly not a whole lot of fact checking to do in episode 6, because most of it is not built around a major historical event from Bass Reeves' life. This episode is more of a setup for the final conclusion. It focuses less on the actual record and more on showing the emotional weight of Bass's career, the violence he has seen, the men he has killed, and the toll all of it is taking on him. So while there is not much historical breakdown here, I do think the show is trying to make a larger point. Bass Reeves may have been a legendary lawman, but that kind of life would have come at a cost. Episode 7 begins with Bass saying goodbye to his horse, Pistol. He tells him, "You were good to me, be good for them now," before heading off to jail for the killing of his cook. From there, the episode leans heavily into the mental and emotional weight Bass is carrying. And I know I've mentioned this a few times, but the show really does play deep into the idea that this job was slowly wearing him down. The series is keeping Esau in Bass's mind, using that fictional character to represent the violence, trauma, guilt, and pressure that have followed him throughout the story. Mrs. O'Neill was not a real prisoner, that was fictional. If you remember earlier in this episode, I talked about how George Reeves would enter Bass in shooting competitions, and Bass would win prizes. When they cut back to the Reeves family eating dinner with Esma is talking about how good of a shot Bass was, and how they come back with a whole wagon chock full, with George Reeves keeping the money. It also mentions Paralee cooking for them, which in real life was Bass's mother. This is a cool reference to the real life story of Bass Reeves. The burning of the scarecrow could have happened, it could not have. The historical record makes no note of it, but it is possible. The murder of Bass Reeves' cook is one of the biggest moments in the series, and it is also one of the most serious events from Bass Reeves' real life. Again, I'm not going to go into every detail. Please go listen to the series I did on him. There, I dive into every single detail, but to summarize it all, in Lawmen Bass Reeves, the cook releases Mrs. O'Neill and lets her escape. When Bass confronts him, the cook accuses him of being nothing more than a slave catcher doing the white man's bidding, and the argument turns personal and ugly. Bass then shoots him, and Billy Crow immediately tells that they need to come up with a story, saying Bass should claim he was cleaning his gun because Judge Parker will not show mercy. Historically, the real man who was a cook was William Leach, and the shooting happened in April of 1884, while Bass and his posse were camped near Cherokee Town in the Chickasaw Nation. Bass had prisoners in custody and was on his way back to Fort Smith. What happened in camp that night depends on which source you believe. Some newspaper accounts painted Bass as a violent man who murdered Leach over a petty argument, while Bass maintained that the shooting was accidental. According to Bass, a cartridge had jammed in his Winchester rifle, and while he was trying to work it loose, the gun went off and struck Leach in the neck. There were also later accounts that involved the dog. The cook was said to have poured boiling grease down the dog's throat, and that treatment is what caused Bass to kill Leach. Regardless, Bass had sent for a doctor as soon as it happened, but in the end, Leach died. But when the case went to court, the testimony was messy and conflicting. Some witnesses said there had been an argument. Others said Bass and Leach had been on friendly terms. Bass's nephew, John Brady, testified that Leach himself said he did not believe Bass shot him on purpose. Mary Grayson, one of the prisoners in camp, her testimony was especially confusing because under questioning her version seemed to shift from Bass deliberately shooting Leach to Bass working on his rifle when it discharged. Bass was arrested in January of 1886 and charged with murder. He spent about 6 months in jail before being released on bond, and the case did not go to trial until October of 1887. The trial was presided over by Judge Isaac C. Parker. Bass's reputation was dragged through the mud in the newspapers, but in the end, the jury found Bass not guilty. The evidence simply was not strong enough to prove murder. There were too many conflicting statements, too many unreliable witnesses, and several important facts in Bass's favor. There was no clear proof that Bass and Leach had a serious ongoing problem. Bass immediately tried to get medical help. He did not flee the country afterward, and he continued working until the charge was finally brought against him. So the TV series takes a real event and heavily fictionalizes the motive and circumstances. There was no Mrs. O'Neill escape, no Billy Crow helping Bass invent the cleaning gun story, and no evidence that William Leach accused Bass of being a slave catcher before being shot. The real case was more complicated. It was either a tragic accident, as Bass claimed, or a camp argument that turned deadly, as one of his enemies in newspapers suggested. What we know for sure is that William Leach died from a gunshot wound. Bass Reeves stood trial for murder, and a Fort Smith jury found him not guilty. The murder trial wore heavily on Bass Reeves, both mentally, by his name and reputation being dragged through the mud in newspapers and rumors, but also financially, as Bass was forced to sell his home in order to pay for his legal expenses. The exact date is not known when Bass was recommissioned as Deputy U.S. Marshal, but it is known that he was business as usual after a while. The ending of episode 7 gives us one of the more dramatic moments in the series. Bass tells Jenny that he loved a boy like he was his own son, Curtis, and that he was going after the man who killed him. Then Bass, Billy Crow, and Cheryl Lynn ride off together, setting up the final confrontation. It is a great scene. It works well for the story the show is telling, and it gives the episode a strong emotional ending. But historically, that is not the truth. The boy, Esau, Billy Crow, and Cheryl Lynn are all part of the fictional storyline built for the series, and that brings episode 7 to a close. The finale, episode 8. We finally made it. And if you're still here and listening, I appreciate y'all. As I've said throughout this breakdown, the whole storyline with Esau, Mr. Sundown, Bass being haunted by him, and all these dramatic flashbacks make for good television. It gives the series a clear villain, a personal revenge story, and a big emotional conclusion. But historically, that is not the real story of Bass Reeves. There was no Mr. Sundown in Bass Reeves' life. Esau was fictional, Cheryl Lynn was fictional, Billy Crow was fictional, and the entire final buildup of Bass chasing down this man from his past is part of the show's created storyline, not something that actually happened. Because of that, I'm not going to go through episode 8 scene by scene. Most of the finale was built around the fictional plot the show created, not around real events of Bass Reeves' life. For example, the scene where Mrs. Reeves, George Reeves' wife, appears at the home of Bass and Jenny and tries to make peace of the whole situation and offers them to come back and work for them, that probably didn't happen. Historically, that would not really make sense anyway. That scene is there for drama. It brings emotion into the story, gives Jenny a connection back to their past. Then the show gives us the entire setup with Esau as a powerful man living in a large ranch house, owning slaves, and sitting in comfort while Bass rides up and calmly mentions Mr. Sundown. That leads into the dinner scene, where Esau places Bass at a table in a way that lets him see Jackson Cole tied up outside. Esau even has the wolf that is a reference to the first episode of him calling them both wolves, and also at the start of episode 5. From there, the finale turns into the big showdown. Bass fights Esau, the shootout breaks out, Bass frees the people from the plantation, Cheryl Lynn's dramatic death, and the show brings its entire fictional storyline to a dramatic end. Bass riding with the freed men, and Jackson Cole telling him no one will know, but he made history. Which leaves it open to the thought that because it was unofficial business, Judge Parker never swore no warrant. They were on their own hook, and this could have happened. And I'll be honest, for the story the show was telling, it works. It is a strong ending, it is emotional, intense, and gives the audience the kind of final confrontation that a television series usually wants. But it is simply just not true. That entire final showdown never happened. Bass Reeves did not ride off with Billy Crow and Cheryl Lynn to confront Esau. He did not find Jackson Cole tied up at a plantation. He did not free a group of enslaved people from Mr. Sundown's ranch. And there was no final revenge mission tied to a boy Bass loved like a son. That was Hollywood. The real Bass Reeves did not need a fictional villain to make his story powerful. And honestly, this is where I think the show almost overplays its hand, because the real man was already fascinating enough. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838. He escaped during the Civil War, survived in Indian Territory, learned native languages, and became one of the first black Deputy U.S. Marshals. He started working under the Fort Smith Court during the era of Judge Isaac C. Parker, the famous hanging judge, and for years he rode into some of the most dangerous country in America. Over the course of his career, Bass Reeves was credited with arresting more than 3,000 criminals. Now that exact number is hard to fully verify, but when you look at the amount of arrests connected to him, including reports of him bringing in wagon loads of prisoners at a time, the number is absolutely believable. He arrested murderers, horse thieves, whiskey peddlers, fugitives, and men who had no intention of being taken. He was also credited with killing 14 men in the line of duty, but Bass always said he never killed a man unless it was necessary to save his own life or carry out the law. And that is an important distinction. He was not some reckless gunfighter looking for a name. He was a lawman with a writ in his hand, and once that writ was given to him, he was known for doing everything in his power to bring that man or woman in. Bass's career stretched across more than 30 years. He worked out of Fort Smith under Judge Parker's court, later worked in connection with the federal court at Paris, Texas, and then served in Muskogee as Indian Territory moved toward Oklahoma statehood. When his time as Deputy U.S. Marshal came to an end around statehood in 1907, he did not simply disappear. He served for about 2 more years on the Muskogee police force before illness finally forced him to step away. He was not perfect. He was not a superhero. He was a real man who lived a hard life, carried a dangerous badge, faced real accusations, real trials, real loss, and real violence. He lost family. He stood trial for murder and was found not guilty. He had his reputation attacked in newspapers, and still, he kept going back out into the territory. And that, to me, is the story worth telling. So while Lawmen Bass Reeves gives us a dramatic, fictional ending, the real ending is much bigger than one shootout or one villain. Bass Reeves spent decades enforcing federal law in Indian Territory and Oklahoma. He built a reputation that outlived nearly every outlaw he ever chased. He became a symbol of courage, discipline, and duty in a place where the law was often thin, fragile, and outgunned. The show gives us a legend shaped for television, but the real story of Bass Reeves was something far better. To close this out, I'll just say this. If you watched Lawmen Bass Reeves and want to know the real story, go listen to my 8-part series on him. Because as good as the show was in certain areas, there is so much more to Bass's life than what the series showed. We talk about all of his major arrests, his shootout with Bob Dozier, full breakdown of his shootout with Jim Webb, the Yawkey Medicine Man story, the full murder trial of William Leach. We got Ned Christie and Belle Starr, and one of the most famous stories of his career, him arresting his own son. So if this episode made you more interested in Bass Reeves, go check it out. Because the real man was far more complicated, far more impressive, and in my opinion, one of the most badass men who ever walked the frontier. I hope you all enjoyed this special episode where I break down the TV series Lawmen Bass Reeves. If this gets enough attention, I will definitely be posting the 8-part series to YouTube. If you like this episode, please give a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you get your podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and review. All of this really helps the podcast grow and reach new listeners. Join the Wild West Deep Dives family. For just $1 a month, you'll get access to bonus content like the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. I can't thank you all enough for all the support. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.